And we are live with Deep Dive. I'm your host, Danielle DiMartino Booth. Today we have something that could not be better timed. We have with us Neil Howe, author of The Fourth Turning, at a time when our nation seems to be turning very rapidly. I could not be any happier to have you with me today, Neil. Hello, greetings from Key Largo. Welcome.
Hi, Danielle. How are you? Yeah, go ahead.
I'm doing great. We don't have enough time. I mean, I'm just going to say that from the get-go. We do not have enough time today. I can say that much. If I get questions and I don't ask them, sorry. I've got too much. We've got just too much to talk about.
There's a lot on the plate, I will say. And I just say, you mentioned Key Largo. As you know, Florida turned out to be a very interesting place in this last election. But we can get to that as we proceed.
Well, let's start with what didn't happen in Florida. Let's start. I'm just going to jump in there. Let's start with Trump and the midterm election results and the rejection of the election denialists. What does this all mean? What is it? The billionaires have stepped back from him. Somebody there in Florida, Ken Griffin, Stephen Schwartzman. Some $63 billion worth of support for the GOP has said it's not going to back Donald Trump. What does this mean about where we are in political America today?
Well, you didn't even mention the Murdoch press with Fox News and Wall Street Journal clearly stepping in a different direction, right? You know, it's interesting. I have talked and actually, you know, this was not designed to be an answer to your question, but I'm writing a book on you know, where the fourth turning is right now and kind of where we are. We did enter something of what those readers of the book will recognize the term a regeneracy in 2016 with the Trump election and how it's energized both sides, right? The red and blue of our political divide, this intense partisanship, rising voter participation, a huge interest in what's happening at the national level, and obviously just polarization across everything, across governorship, Supreme Court, all the way down to election for dog catcher in your local neighborhood. I mean, and this change is not necessarily the only regeneracy we will have, right? It could shift. In other words, you could have a new definition of the two sides. And I do believe that there's a real possibility of that. And let me just summarize what I think we've learned in this last election, if I could, in terms of what did not change and what did, okay? What did not change is some of the fundamental shifts that have gone on in partisanship and engagement. I mean, if you look at the turnout, again, very high, not quite as high as 2018, which is the last midterm year, but completely different from every election before Trump election in 2016, right? Where we had that huge jump in participation of every age bracket, every income group, and that has continued. Still quite high turnout rate. The electorate is even more polarized in terms of Republicans and Democrats. You see Republicans even more likely to vote for Republicans, Democrats for Democrats. And you don't find any fundamental change in gender. I mean, we'll get to that probably, but gender, age, income, you know, that kind of stuff. No fundamental change there. What explains the poor performance? Okay. And here's I would put it. And a little concession first. The Republicans did an excellent job in this last election at getting their side to turn out, right? Compared to 2018, the Republicans got 1 million more people to the polls, Democrats 7 million less. So the share of Republicans versus Democrats coming to the polls were basically back to where they were in 2014, you know, the last midterm before 2018. Where 2018, the Democrats had a big advantage in turnout. The Democrats were ginned up. The Republicans were a little bit demoralized. Today, it was the reverse. That was a great advantage for the Republicans. But what happened? They lost a huge share of the independent vote. Now, I'm sure we're going to talk about this. But right now, when you think about elections, you're dealing with a third, right? Roughly a third people identify with Democrats, a third with Republicans, a third with independents. They're all equally important quantitatively. What happened is, yeah, they got all the Republicans out. Democrats didn't, as many came out, but they lost 10 percentage points of the independent vote. That's 10% of a third. That's more than 3 percentage points of the total vote. That's what killed them. And that's what they were counting on, and that's what they didn't get. Why didn't they get that? Now I get to the question you asked, which has to do with the MAGA candidates, right? We're talking about the Stop the Steal, the QAnon,
Yep.
The people like that. They underperformed everywhere. They underperformed relative to the other candidates in their same state or versus Republican, Biden versus Trump in the same district back in 2020. Do you see what I mean?
Yep.
So everywhere you look, and you just see that. I mean, you can go down, my favorite example is, Lauren Boebert, who is still on the bubble right now. She's like one of the congressmen that is not elected. She's a 27, 28-year-old total MAGA Republican. She was in a district that was considered solid for Republicans. It is still undecided. All of the other places where Republicans could actually win are moderate candidates in toss-up districts. And you see that across the board. Why didn't Kerry Lake win governorship in Arizona? I mean, that should be a slam dunk, and it could have been for another candidate. Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania, what in the world was he doing running, right? He didn't have a chance, and he pulled down other Republicans in that state. And when you go into the Senate candidates, Don Bolduc versus Maggie Hassan, that just killed him. Maggie Hassan is one of the most beatable, vulnerable candidates in the Senate. She's in New Hampshire, and they ran this, total Trump true believer. They could have had, obviously, if Sununu had run, they would have walked away with it, but they could have had any other candidate beat him. Oz versus Fetterman, Blake Masters versus Mark Kelly. You just go down the list, right? And Herschel Walker. What explains that? No one in Georgia wanted Herschel Walker. I mean, the Republicans in Georgia didn't want Herschel Walker, but Trump intervened and got him, and we'll see. That one's going to be decided, obviously, next month. So this is kind of answering your question. It killed him, and I think everyone understands that. This is why you're getting the reaction. This is why, the media is shifting, why the big donors are shifting. The real question is the base going to shift, right? Are the voters going to shift? And how much can you, how long can you vote for a loser?
Well, and so
how many times can you vote for a loser?
And yet he's thrown his hat in the ring, and he obviously means to be a disruptive element in 2024 in some way. Will this not splinter the party? Are we not faced with a potential Ross Perot moment where we have a third candidate?
Well, this is the question you raise, and I've actually talked to several people about it. The real question is, would Trump actually run a third-party candidacy, right? And the real question is, what does Trump, and you mentioned, you go back to the examples of, Teddy Roosevelt and Ross Perot, and you think of all your great third party, originally the Republican Party was a third party, right? And these were principled candidates of people who wanted to sit up and do their thing because they thought it was important for the country. It wasn't about themselves or willing to lose. I'm wondering whether Trump is that kind of candidate. Does he want to do something where he's sure to lose, come in a third, be just the total loser, right? The total. I'm not sure that he would do that. And I've talked to many people. I don't know he would do that. What he would love to do is win the Republican nomination, and I'm not sure he can do that.
I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, you're in Florida. You are in the state of what I call the next JFK. You know, Ron DeSantis is seen as, you know, I mean, we've got a bunch of octogenarians running the country, and I think that there is a tacit rejection. I think the country is ready for somebody young, new blood, and you know, his resounding victory tells you that the country wants to go in a different direction.
It was a huge victory. I mean, my gosh, you know, taking Miami-Dade. I mean, that's the ultimate, right? As well as the sizable margin that many of the Latino candidates got here. You know, Cuban, Latino. He won. It was very impressive. And I've looked at many of the surveys that have come out, you know, of voters and so on. He's rising a lot, and he's been rising a lot, obviously, since the election. Trump sometimes wins some of those surveys, but here's the thing. A lot of people still aren't terribly familiar with DeSantis, right? Everyone in America, everyone in the world, in fact, knows who Trump is, right? So they all have an opinion about him. They've all made their decision. But DeSantis is still, I would say he has a huge amount of improvement room. Trump doesn't. You look at many of these polls, they have a majority of Republicans saying he should not run, right? So in other words, they've already made up their mind. But if you ask people, a lot of people aren't quite sure who DeSantis is. I think he has huge upward potential. And, you know, that's, I think that's a definite way that the Republican Party can go.
So let's stay on the subject of octogenarians for just a second. What do you make of the fate of the Democratic Party if Joe Biden continues to insist that he may run again in 2024? Isn't this setting up for disaster?
I don't think he's going to run.
Okay.
I just don't think he's going to run. I think he's claiming he's not going to run because he doesn't want to declare himself a lame duck instantly, right? You know, that just kills you. You know, I'm not going to run, therefore no one really cares anymore about cooperating with me.
So let's stay on the subject of lame duck. So let's dispense with Joe Biden and move on and move on to the idea of lame duck, of the debt ceiling, of shutting the government down. Why wouldn't Kevin McCarthy shut the government? There's not a single government employee who's going to vote Republican anyways. They're not going to offend anybody. So what does Kevin McCarthy taking the gavel mean after the Democrats just destroying, rubbing the GOP's nose in it for 2 solid years? What does this mean in a nation where we've grown very accustomed to stimulus?
Here's my assessment of it, Danielle, and this is why I think that the markets responded positively to the election late last week. I don't think it was just the inflation number. I don't know about you, but I was underwhelmed by the, you know, you look at the PCE particularly. Look, we're not talking about inflation right now, but I don't think that was the reason. I think the reason was the markets were positively impressed, and for this reason, it looks as though the Republicans will have a majority, a bare majority, enough to veto anything Biden puts through, but not enough to do any damage on their own. In other words, with a 3-person majority, you can't actually do anything. All you can do is block stuff, right? So I think the markets thought that was about as good as we can do.
So Joe Manchin said no to basically to resolving the debt ceiling during the lame duck session. Can we see the U.S. government shut down? Will we violate the debt ceiling? Is any of this a feasibility given the paper-thin margin that the GOP has in the House?
I remember going through the debt ceiling in 2010 and 2011, and I remember it was all smoke and mirrors and, you know, playing chicken and, you know, I've removed the steering wheel from my car and, you know, all of that kind of stuff. And I'm really not impressed by it. It kind of makes my eyes glaze over when I see people trying to do it a second time.
You're not alone, but it took the markets down in 2011, Neil.
I think the markets may actually respond less this time. First of all, I think it's very clear that given appropriation law that interest on the debt would be paid, even if it came to that. I don't think it would be, but I think if it came to that, interest on the debt and the rolling over of debt and all that would not be impaired in extremis. But I think all of this is showboating, and more importantly, again, I come back to this point with a 3-person, at most 4. I mean, we'll see. Actually, Lauren Boebert may be the reason, the difference between a 3 and a 4 person member majority for Kevin McCarthy. But with that, he can't really act. He can't really take any kind of decisive action. It just takes a few moderates to say, this is crazy, I'm out of here, right? And so it's unclear. I think I'm not worried about that at the moment, frankly.
All right.
I think McCarthy has bigger worries. He has to get elected. He has to get elected as speaker. I think he will, because I can't imagine any GOP person actually voting for the Democrats. It's going to be 2. One party gets to nominate one party gets to nominate the other. But if you're worried about something happening, I don't know. That doesn't concern me right now. I'm more concerned about where the country's going.
Well, let's talk about the first real recession that the millennials have ever had to survive. Let's talk about Jay Powell, the new Jay Powell. I call him Make My Day Jay. He does not look like he's going to pivot. He does not look like he's going to bail out this economy. It looks like we're going to have a real recession. What does this mean for the quiet quitting generation, the millennials, a term you coined?
Yes. Well, this is going to be, for first wave millennials born in the early 80s, this will be their 3rd recession.
But it's not a recession that the Fed is necessarily going to bail out. That's a game changer.
That's a game changer for a lot of people.
Oh, yes.
That's a game changer for a lot of Xers who never remember that either. It's been a long time since how many people remember Volcker? I mean, seriously.
Right.
And so we do have a repeat of that. I think it is going to be harsh. I think the market, we're talking about markets, but I think they pivoted a little bit too strongly on some of this, on some of these inflation numbers. And I know that you know a lot more about this than I do, Danielle, but certainly some of them are hinting that, we can slow down now and so on. But I do believe that inflation could be a more enduring problem. And if Jerome Powell really wants to get the full employment inflation rate down to under 2%, I mean full employment inflation rate, meaning it's not enough that it just goes down below 2% while the economy is in recession, right? I mean, he's supposed to be thinking longer term. It has to be under 2% coming out of the recession, right? So think about that. And I keep telling people a Taylor rule would mean a much higher Fed funds rate right now, and would mean,
that's right.
You understand what I mean?
So, there are implications for the millennials having their first true recession where nobody's going to bail them out. There are even bigger implications for inequality. If Powell gets interest rates up and, as you suggest, keeps them high, something none of us have experienced because we don't, so few remember the Volcker era, but if he keeps interest rates high, it's going to be an effective war on inequality, an effective war on the billionaires, because they've always been bailed out. They've had the rules rewritten since August the 12th, 1987, when Alan Greenspan stepped into office. What does this mean for inequality in America? Could this be a good thing?
Well, it could be a good thing because there's one thing you're forgetting. There is an opportunity for, and this all depends. Now, it could get. Let me actually rephrase this carefully. The real problem is not just that Powell's raising rates and we go into this rather severe recession. Mm-hmm. The real problem is that with these much higher interest rates on top of everything that the federal government has borrowed since 2008, the long-term projections explode. I actually do a presentation every year, Danielle, on the long-term CBO projections, going up to 30 years, up to the late 2050s. And that's already beginning to shift, right? You have this enormous, we've borrowed as much as a share of GDP since the GFC as we borrowed in World War II. And you might just say, well, we haven't exactly saved the world from fascism, right? I mean, what have we done with all that, right?
What do we have to show for it?
And what if we actually have to confront a real crisis where we have to borrow that amount? Where do we go? Who gets rationed out? Who gets rationed in? I will say this, in these kinds of emergency situations, often that's not bad for equality. Because what happens in real crisis situations is you start allocating everything according to necessity. You know what I mean?
Yep.
You take wealth away from the wealthy and you give people enough to live in, and you're basically in a command and control economy. And I would like to remind people, going back to the climax of worth earnings, that always happens, right? That always happens. You basically live in a regimented economy and everything gets, you have financial repression and confiscations and price controls. You do what's needed. In other words, everything gets socialized in an emergency. And that's just the rule of necessity. It's the rule of history.
So let's talk about the fact that we've got nothing to show for all this debt that we've piled on. In the past, when other countries have piled on this much debt and accumulated enemies along the way, the reserve currency status. Now, this is a very, talk about turnings. More than 100 years here that we've enjoyed this status. Is that at risk? And I'm going to shift gears just a little bit because I'm getting to what everybody wants to talk about. Would it necessarily be, since the fall of Rome, right, Neil? Since the fall of Rome, it's always been a hot war that has unseated a reserve currency status all the way through British pound sterling. Would it be a hot war, or could possibly, are the Bitcoiners right? Could we have a non-sovereign reserve currency? I'll leave my opinion out of this. I'll let you answer.
No. A non-sovereign currency at a time of crisis, that's a non-starter.
Okay.
No one can enforce it. Okay, so that never happens. And in fact, this is a very bad time for libertarian solutions. Look, libertarian solutions are great at a time of peace, right? When everyone feels confident, everyone feels that their individual rights will be enforced no matter the circumstances. That's not what happens in a crisis, right, Danielle? And and I think, this is why during times of crisis, we all go back to things which are, again, we go back to the kind of command and control situation. Look, I would say that there are dangers out there. What I'm worried about is the fact that the net U.S. indebtedness to the rest of the world is rapidly rising. You just see that it's going negative for the first time, and it's rapidly plunging now every year. And a large share of this debt, as you know, is now owned by foreigners. And one solution, and I'm sure you talk about this to investors, Danielle, I certainly mention it sometimes, is that we are not going to end up with a very, a perfect Jerome Powell solution where you have a very low inflation rate. That a higher inflation rate, as so long as it's not accelerating, is actually part of the inevitable solution, right?
Mm-hmm. Inflate away the debt.
We do it every time. We certainly did it after World War II. And a large reason why we got that World War II share of debt down, partly because we ran surpluses during the Truman and Eisenhower years, but mostly because we had a lot of economic growth too, real growth. We had a lot of inflation over those years. And during the 1970s, whoa, it just went right down. Right? Nothing like a lot of inflation to solve your debt problems. Inflation always works in favor of debtors and at the expense of creditors. And the United States was a debtor, right? So that's how we solved that problem. I'm not sure if we'll do that again. And remember, this also works in the private sector. You know, for everyone with, I don't know, anything from student loans to mortgages. This is one way to affect income equality. And I will say there are many, many historical parallels for this. We've done it many times before in history. This is certainly not a first. It's a way, for instance, during the Weimar Republic, it's how basically Germany, now they couldn't pay the Allies back in inflated currency because that had to be, you know, gold sterling, right? But they could mobilize and they could defund all of Germany's middle classes and all of their industrials, take all the wealth away from them by inflating away everything that they had saved in the past. They did that at the cost of fomenting a horrible social revolution. And we're all, I think, familiar with what happened there.
Let's move on to the thing that I think probably 90% of the questions coming in are revolving around. I mean, when you think of share or print, you know, icons that go by one name, and then we have SBF and this cult of crypto and what appears to be a fearful regulatory community that is just hoping this whole situation will just go away, vanish, that these bankruptcies will stop happening, that these crises will stop popping up. Talk to me about the cult of crypto, about an effective Ponzi scheme that was built on leverage and a million accounts, smithereens. What is happening? What does this say about our society?
Not just a million accounts, but we've actually done a number of pieces on this, sort of the socio-demographic characteristics of Bitcoin investors. And when you look at the actual number of investors, not necessarily the actual asset amounts, the big expansion of the people who came into the market, particularly in the last 2 or 3 years, are unsophisticated investors, lower income and minority, right? And these are the people that are losing. They're buying in late and they're losing big time. I would just say this, the reason why crypto valuations shot up so much was the unnatural negative real interest rates that we experienced since, you know, just before the beginning of the pandemic, you know, up until about 6 months ago, right, Danielle? And what that did was it just made anything a good investment. You know what I mean? I just, you know, anything. It didn't matter what. And now that's all coming to an end. In other words, I think there's no way to separate what's happening to crypto from the reality of the changing real interest rate structure. We've gone from negative 1% real, you know, long-term real interest rates to, you know, 250 basis points up. We're now like a 1.5 real. That just changes everything. It just revalues everything. Anything way in the future gets devalued. That's the tech, right? We've seen tech come down, and we see credit margins increase for the same reason. Suddenly, money actually costs something again.
Yep.
People care about, you know, what they're getting in return for it. They didn't care 2 years ago about that.
So what happens to the rejected masses who came in late? What do they do? Where do they funnel this anger? Because let me tell you, they're on my Twitter feed and they're mad.
Well, if they're in that Twitter feed, that's my first question. Where do you think they'll be focusing the same. Seriously. I mean, no, I have another way of answering that question, but I'm first curious, what do they say? Who are they mad at?
Oh, they're mad at the system. They've been done wrong.
Which system? Is it the system that didn't regulate them? Or is it the system, you know what I mean? It could be the Democratic system, the Republican, in other words, that's my question.
No, you know what, Neil, to me, the parallels are so distinct because they're the same exact people who are of the opinion that I'm not going to take it anymore. You will pay me what I want. Corporate America doesn't belong here. We're going to put the big guys out of business. It's the same exact mentality as the people who were playing the meme stocks or SPACs. And they all think it's us against them. It's us against the 1%.
In my opinion, this is another version of the subprime. It's the same thing. People who bought late got the subprime mortgages. They were the ones who bought the houses when they were expensive. They were the ones who lost the most. I remember very well, Danielle, how that worked out for them, right? It was horrible. You remember all those shows about, these. I think we're kind of doing that with a somewhat new set of people. I will say one thing though, very interesting, that now that you raised it about particularly with minorities, which I just said, we're actually disproportionately investors in crypto late. And I'd be interested, Danielle, in your reaction to this, because this also came clear with the exit polls. As you know, since 2016, the Republican Party has done progressively better in 2018, 2020 in minority voters. They made another huge pickup in this last election, and I just was gonna note this. White men and women increased their share of everyone increased their share of the Republican, of Republicans, because Republicans did a lot better than 2018 if you're comparing with 2018. But it's the differential that interests me, Danielle. That's what I wanted to look at here. If you look at white men and women, they increased by about 7 to 8%, voting more Republican than they did back in 2018. Black men and black women is 7 and 11%. Okay, 7 and 11%. Latino men and Latino women is 14 and 21% more than they did in 2018. And Asian Americans, it's off the charts. It's almost 30 percentage points up. Now, admittedly, 2018 was a very bad performance for Asian Americans for the Republican Party, but it's a big difference. This is intriguing to me, and I'm kind of asking you. This data is just coming up now, and so, what do you think of this? Now we've seen, South Texas, we've seen the Cuban community. We certainly saw what Ron DeSantis did in Florida among Latinos. But I'd be interested in your take. How do you assess this trend? Maybe it's because I don't know. Maybe it's because Trump was not on the ticket this time. He was neither president nor not on the ticket for the first election since 2014.
Well, I mean, look, Trump is perceived. I live in Texas. George W. Bush got 2/3 of the Hispanic vote when he ran for the governor the second time in Texas. So I've witnessed the phenomena firsthand. People don't want to be discriminated against. It doesn't work that way. And Trump was probably the most discriminatory president that we've ever seen. And the rejection of that among people who have very, very good social values, hard workers, they don't want to see this crime either, by the way.
No, I totally get that. And I actually agree with your assessment. We're dealing with a community. One of the biggest strains within the Democratic Party is that it has the leaders, highly educated, bi-coastal, almost entirely white, and they are very, shall I say, advanced and progressive in their cultural values. And then you have Southeastern Southeastern America, where you have African community that's among the most religious and the most culturally conservative community, along with Latinos. This is an enormous strain in the Democratic Party. And it's showing itself, right? I mean, if I were a Democrat, I'd be saying, this is a problem moving forward. How do we deal with this? Because if they were losing these people at this rate with Trump, you know what I mean? I'm not sure I have to finish that sentence, right?
Sure.
What are they going to do when Trump is not there and you continue to have these strains?
That's exactly right. And I think that that's something to be considered on a long-term basis. I'm getting a million questions about something you mentioned when you were up in Greenwich last time I saw you. You were saying at that time, you were like, it's a toss-up. It's either going to be civil war first or a hot war first, or civil war first. So, before the Olympics, it looked like there was a much more formal, if you will, Chinese-Russian alliance. After the Olympics, not as much. We see that China doesn't have as much money as we thought. It's not going to be the global economy's savior. And yet we've got a dictatorship that's taken hold. So everybody's asking me, is Taiwan next? Is a world war next? Or do we have a greater chance with the divisiveness that we have of civil war first?
Well, I can give you my answer, which will, partly, gratify people, but may also disappoint them in the sense that the question of great power war versus civil war, I guess, and just to preview a little bit, something I talk about a lot in this book, the choice between the two is sometimes overdrawn because every crisis we have is usually a combination of both. And this is actually an important point that people often don't understand. Everyone looks at, World War II as, the good war because it was, us versus them abroad. But they don't realize that when you take the entire crisis era from the Great Depression, the New Deal, to World War II, you realize that the New Deal part of that crisis was enormously divisive and polarizing in America. Mm-hmm. And to some extent, it still is among people, right? I mean, Roosevelt was that man. Franklin Stalino Roosevelt.
Oh, look, my mother still talks about being in South Texas and Roosevelt coming in and killing all the cows. I mean, there's some long-standing bitterness about that man.
So you got that, and on the right they called the 1930s the Red Decade, and on the left they called it the Fascist Decade. Anyway, you don't have to go into that, but my point is that crisis was actually unusual, that it climaxed finally in almost an entirely us versus them deal. You know what I mean? It was America against fascism.
Well, that was the last time inequality was that was the last time in U.S. history that inequality was as acute as it is today. Was in that era. I mean, leading up to the Great Depression and the haves and the have-nots.
During the war and after the war, the late 40s and 50s, an enormous reduction in inequality.
Yep.
I mean, that was the Great Compression, economists call it. And, Thomas Piketty talks about that, and he says, well, that's just an exception to the general rule. That's not the exception. That happens every time during and after a crisis. I talk about that in the book. Anyway, Civil War was obviously almost entirely an internal crisis, right? The American Revolution was much more of a civil war than most people realize. And I often remind people that during the American Revolution, a lot more Americans killed Americans than British killed Americans. And in fact, in much of the South, it was a bloody civil war, with reprisals and massive deaths within the South. And when the British finally left, 100,000 loyalists went with them. Today, that would be equivalent to about 7 million Americans leaving. And by the way, at that time in 1783, those were the most educated, wealthiest. Those are the Americans that knew how to do everything, right? They were the bankers, the people who managed commerce, and that was an enormous economic hit for America. But my point is, when you go back through these crises, they're always on a spectrum of internal and external. That's the first point I want to make, Danielle. It's not just, you have totally one or totally the other, all right? And I think we see that today in America, even if we have an external crisis, there will always be somehow the internal crisis somehow feeding into that. The second point is that a very, very interesting point about Russia and China, and you said this, and certainly, I talk about China's fertility rate all the time, and this is a complete mind-boggling new reality for China, that they've suddenly seen this precipitous and unexpected decline. And now the UN is looking at the future, and they're seeing most of the rest of the century, they're going to be losing 10 million Chinese. This is the most rapidly, in absolute numbers, the most rapidly depopulating country in the world for the next, 7 decades. So this is the lesson of history. And this has to do with a political scientist by the name of Organsky, who actually talked a lot about power trajectories, right? Power. In other words, every great power looks at its future power trajectory going forward. And what they pointed out was, when a country sees that it is threatened in its long-term prospects vis-a-vis its rival, that actually precipitates more rapid action, right? The psychology becomes, Danielle, I better do something now because I'm not going to get a better chance. Remember that for so long, China's philosophy, remember Deng Xiaoping onward, and then Wen Jiabao and all the others, the philosophy was just, hide your capabilities and prosper, right? The future's on our side. We can always wait. The more time goes by, the stronger we get relative to other people. So why in the world would we want to foment a crisis, right? We just keep getting stronger. I think the time is coming. China's seeing that's not actually going to happen. We need to actually change things. We need to shuffle things up. We need to change the reality, change the psychology. We need to intervene. And people who say that when China realizes its future and its resources in terms of productivity, employment growth, technology is not quite what they expected, that this will diminish the chance for war. I'm afraid I differ. I think it actually pulls up, right?
Well,
the window.
Look, if you're a corporation that used to run the world and you used to have monopoly power and you start to become marginalized, what do? You acquire, you buy revenues. Yeah. So my question.
You also just take more chances. Because
right.
if I'm going to be in the dustbin anyway, I might as well try to make something happen, right?
Okay, so I have a different question. I'm just going to leapfrog over. Who does Taiwan choose?
What do you mean? Who does Taiwan choose?
Would the Taiwanese feel that they were better positioned to side with China? Or would they side with the West?
Oh, I think Taiwan has totally made up its mind on that question, right? And by the way, whoever was undecided was decided after looking at Hong Kong, right? I mean, that just decided all of the remaining. And in fact, the Nationalist Kuomintang Party has come over to the side of Taiwanese independence to survive as a party. I mean, they had no future in what they were, this idea of amalgamation with mainland China today is dead in Taiwan. I mean, just dead. And the younger you are, the deader it is, right, in Taiwan. So
I'm gonna ask you the same question, but as it pertains to a different country, because there's been more foreign direct investment. There's been more trade. There's been more exports. Who would Germany choose?
Well, Germany likes to go along to get along, right? I don't know who they would choose. The real question is, who would they be compelled to choose, just given the realities of geopolitics? No, I mean, if Germany, is just worried about, the handel, the trade, yeah, they would just do anything to choose to do business with mainland China, right? That's
Well,
where all the
Schultz
sales
was
are.
just,
Exactly.
the chancellor was just there.
Exactly. But remember, they had to move rapidly to keep up with changing events in the Ukraine and with NATO. And this great turning point. And the amazing thing in Germany is a democratic socialist party, which has always been, in favor of Ostpolitik and détente and getting along with Russia, has been at the forefront, along with the Green Party, of rearming Germany and rearming Europe against the threat of Russia. I don't think Germany is as strong as you think. I don't think Germany can just make its own national choices without getting a consensus of the rest of the EU and the rest of what we used to call the free world.
Okay, I've got too many things to cover here. There was a 60-minute story recently about Chinese children being limited to 40 minutes of TikTok, and even that 40 minutes had to be salubrious. It had to be about museums or science. How do we turn America's children off? How do we turn the damn devices off and get our children back?
Yeah, I think, look, whenever China does that, they get, I think, sort of secret applause from Gen X parents all over America, who are thinking, my God, if only I could do that. Look, the problem for parents, as you well know, is that, cell phones and all these devices are also the means by which parents keep track of the children, right? So this is the problem, because the parents always want to keep track of what their kids are doing and so on. So they can't, it's practically very difficult to take these communication devices away. It's very difficult to actually have an app that the teenager won't know how to undo. The real question is whether or not TikTok itself will be banned by government. As you know, that may happen for reasons having nothing to do with teenagers watching it. And I think a decision, the Biden administration is studying it, and I think a decision is expected sometime in March or April of next year, when they're going to reach a decision. That would be great news for Meta, I guess, right? But at least a short-term great news. I think Meta has bigger problems than that. But it's I think a lot of it has to do with just good parenting, Danielle, and keeping your child interested in life and making sure they're actually involved and engaged in the real world. And if an extremist, that means actually taking the device away, well, so be it. An interesting question is, how could government actually help parents? Now, a lot of these Gen X parents, as you know, are pretty libertarian. It's not exactly hard to imagine them actually supporting. I mean, these are the parents who don't like face masks, right, and all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
It's hard to imagine them actually favoring that kind of thing. But I will say that when she came out with those proposals, there was a part of every parent that was saying, God, I wish I could do that.
Yep. So the last great big question that everybody wants an update on is, where are we in the fourth turning? Has time been pulled forward? Has time been pushed back? Are we still looking at the tail end of this decade? Where are we?
Well, I think the full period, the full era, will, my best guess is, comes to an end in the early 2030s. This is something, again.
That's a decade. That's 10 years.
Yeah, that's a good 10 years. And the reason is this. we've seen changes in the length of the saculum, seen changes in the length of the cycle over the entire history of modernity, starting from the Renaissance onward. And the changes in the length of these turnings and the cycle is really governed by changes in the amount of time required to traverse each phase of life, meaning from birth to adulthood, from adulthood to midlife, meaning, being deemed capable of taking over America's, largest institutions like presidency. And then again, when are you considered sort of, completely retired? I think throughout much of history, these phases of life are actually becoming more compressed, right? As young people actually became more active in public life earlier. And I document actually how that has happened through the middle or even late into the 20th century. In recent decades, we're going very rapidly the other way, Danielle. Look at young people now, how long it takes for them after they're born to do anything we consider part of actually being an adult. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Getting married, having kids, being truly independent in your career, owning your own home. I mean, that's just hugely rising. We just see 7, 6, 7, 8 year increases now in marriage age of first child, age of home ownership. And we've seen the same thing actually in running for office now, into Congress, into Senate. And my God, we have 3 octogenarians by the end of this year as president, as Speaker of the House, and as Senate Majority Leader, right? That's without precedent. So every phase of life is getting longer. And I do think that this dilation of phases of life is actually slowing down the cycle a bit, and actually expanding a little bit the length of generations. And this is leading to a somewhat, longer period. And you can actually just see that. Look at politics. Look at the fact that young people don't have the voice in politics that they used to have, right? And older people were dying at younger ages and certainly weren't in power and superintending institutions at the same age that they are today.
I've got an interesting question that came in about a central bank digital currency. Obviously, we took universal basic income, modern monetary theory, we took that all on a test drive, and we got a whole lot of inflation to show for it. So do you think it's conceivable that we end up at some point, you never know what politicians are going to allow if they're pressed, do you think we could possibly see kind of a control function, if you will, a central bank digital currency, or will it be more of the same? What we've heard from the New York Fed, that there are 12 large institutions that are going to talk about digitizing the dollar, and away we go with one more chapter of U.S. banks running everything.
Well, I think one of the reasons why the U.S. has been slow to move, and why some of the European countries, think of Sweden, for instance, has been faster to move in the direction of a just what seems like a no-brainer, right? I mean, just an easy digital currency to send abroad, or you know what I mean, just arrange your transactions, is because of the banking lobby in America. I mean, banks don't want that.
Yeah.
And the Fed is just a bunch of bankers. I mean, they're the last person in the world who are going to want a digital currency, not because it isn't a good idea, but because they all are bankers. I mean, these are the people who would truly be undermining their own revenue source and what they do as a business by this. But it makes eminent sense. It actually, I think it can be done securely. It doesn't have to be done in it doesn't have to be in Bitcoin, obviously, and it doesn't require the same technology. It could just be sort of a top-down system for keeping track of anyone's ledger. But I do think that demand for it publicly will be strong enough, particularly as younger people just think it's crazy, not to take advantage of this. I mean, just think about the fact that so many more young people are now using banks now that banks have gone digital.
Right.
They don't have to go to some stupid, branch office somewhere and drive their car and actually write these, you know what I mean? And so I think that the electorate will insist on it. And I think one way or another, the Fed kicking and screaming and all those bankers, they're going to have to give us one, right? And whoever's president, who's ever head of a party that really wants to please people, is going to figure out a way to provide us with that.
So we've got about 3 minutes left. I'm going to ask you one last selfish question. Since Elon Musk took over Twitter, the situation with my Twitter feed being absolutely bombarded by bots is just making me crazy. I mean, there's obviously a machine somewhere cranking this out by nefarious characters. Do you think we could see a social media platform fail?
Well, in my opinion, most social media platforms are already failures. I mean, I don't visit them. I don't use it. I have a Twitter feed, and I do enjoy, looking at what comes across. But I must say, social media just isn't my preferred method of acquiring information. Elon Musk is kind of a Gen X CEO gone crazy. I mean, he's
you
just
think
all
so?
over. He's got probably 500% more on his plate than he can possibly accomplish.
Mm-hmm.
I wonder now about that, rocket headed for the moon, whether Musk is even tracking where the hell it's going. I mean, the guy is scattered in a million directions right now. And I do say that I think that it's not helping Tesla's price.
No.
Not helping its price.
No, I mean, he's lost, what, $150 billion? I mean, just unfathomable net worth.
Right. Right. And he seems to be, in terms of the morale of the company, what he's doing with Twitter seems to be exactly on par with what he's already done at Tesla and SpaceX.
All right, Neil, any parting thoughts? We've got about a minute left. What did I not ask you?
Gosh, we've been over a lot. I just was going to mention one thing, actually. It was one of many things on my plate. Women actually showed up as much as they did in 2008. There was no difference in that rate. But here's the interesting thing. They actually moved slightly more to the Republican column than men did, which means, Danielle, that the abortion issue just simply failed to show up. In other words, the shares of the two genders that showed up to vote was the same, but we saw no particular change. If anything, a change toward the Republicans that may have been actually really pushed by this outsized increase in minority women voting more for the Republican Party than they had. But I think that's an interesting development, given that so many people were talking about it before the election.
Well, we will follow that. We've run out of time. Like I said, we could have done this for 2 hours.
No, we could have gone on.
But let's do it in person next time. And I want to thank you so much. This has been so eye-opening and enlightening and insightful.
It's a total pleasure to be on with you. So I really had a good time. Thanks, Danielle.
Thank you, Neil. Until next time, I mean, blown away. I'm going to have to watch it 3 more times myself. And thank you for joining us today. Take care.